Well, this is our 5th webinar for the Project Streamlined course. Hopefully these optional lectures are getting you prepared for the class, and hopefully it helps you get you the most out of MS Project. The learning approach we've been using here is called the flipped classroom. It was actually made famous more or less in recent memory by a guy by the name of Salman Khan of the Khan Academy. He's actually a really interesting TED Talks video available. Let me see if I can put that up on the screen. That's a very interesting video. It talks about how he reinvented education. At the end of it, actually, Bill Gates from Microsoft actually does a walk-on. It's an interesting video. Personally, believe it or not, that's what we're doing here is the flipped classroom approach, where we have everybody watch the videos and then you come back weekly and we do the webinars for review. I think it's a great approach. It takes a lot of effort, but I think the results are much better. You watch that TED Talk video, it's very interesting. But for project managers, there's I think a more important aspect, and it has to do with a lot of the research on experts. One of the more interesting research papers, I thought, you guys may have your own opinion on this, was the theory of experts developed by a guy by the name of Anders Ericsson. And let me pop his paper up on the screen here. This goes back a couple of years. I think it's 2007. It's out of Harvard Business Review. Interesting article. It talks about how to make an expert. Interesting observations about there is no such thing as born experts. It comes through lots of effort. Interesting article. My point is online learning, I think, has a definite role to play for the developing of expertise for us as project managers and for our kids. And that article, I thought, is really got some excellent research in there. Again, my goal for the training is to make the stuff informative, keep it interesting. That's why I try to throw out stuff like TED Talk and the Anders Ericsson expert paper there. And not everyone is as passionate about Microsoft Project as I may be, but a lot of project managers need to become proficient in their work and especially how Microsoft Project works. It's a very powerful tool, and I know a lot of people use Excel and spreadsheets, but to really be good at your craft, you have to use something like Microsoft Project. And if you're going to be an expert, which is what taking the PMP exam is all about, is getting all those PDU hours in, putting time into the profession. That's what Anders Ericsson's paper also talks about, the number of hours you have to have. I think we recently had a presentation where one of the presenters said you had to have at least 1,000 hours involved in dedicated learning to become an expert. That's what it's all about. That's how we make our livings. All right, so tonight we cover task constraints. That's a very challenging and complex topic. It's probably the hardest part of Microsoft Project, the part that most people get wrong, in my opinion. So last time we covered critical path and task outlining, and before that we covered task linking. So this is really the apex of the hill, in my opinion, in learning Microsoft Project from a desktop or practical point of view. Okay, so let's do a quick review of tonight's agenda. I'm going to do things a little bit differently tonight. I'm going to start out with a review of the 14 videos for constraints, and I'm going to intersperse it with quiz questions and quick tips throughout that review. And then once we get through all 14 videos, I'm going to use the story problem I sent out to demonstrate, again, some of the features of constraints. So I don't want to just rehash the videos tonight. Of course, that's not the purpose of these webinars. I want to expand on the content. Okay, so I am going to switch. Let's see, I'm going to share. I'm going to do a poll. Okay, so here's the question. True or false? You can put in a constraint accidentally by entering a date in the start date column, but you can type in the finish date column and not create a constraint. The answer should be false. And I think everybody answered true, so I think I stumped you all there. So if you enter in the start date, and let me bring up Microsoft Project, and I put in a test task. Okay, if I go in and type in the start date, so I put, say, August 1st, 8/1, guess what? You get a SNet. You create a constraint. If I put in another test task, and I type in the finish date, let's say 8/2, and guess what? You created another constraint. You've created an FNet. So depending on if you type in the start or finish date, you can create a start no earlier than or finish no earlier than constraint, which of course is not desirable unless you know what you're doing. A lot of beginners do that by accident, and if you ever get a project schedule that has nothing but blue dot calendar icons in the indicators column, you know somebody's been typing in the start or finish date column. It's just not normal to use a lot of constraints. at least not if you're using project to drive out dynamic schedules. All right, so that first video, the first video was on task entry. Okay, and what went on in that lecture, it introduced the concept of constraints. It brought the 8 different constraints available on the screen. It goes through this accidental entry of constraints by typing in the start or finish state. And basically, there's a lot of good content there. It was a very good starter for just the concept of constraints. This is quiz number 2. Let me see if I can find it. Multiple choice. How do you get to a task constraint type? Do you double click on the task and go to the Advanced tab? Do you right click on the task and select task information and then go to the Advanced tab? Or do you split the screen and use the constraints field in the task details form? Or do you insert the constraint types column into the Gantt chart table? Well, the answer is all of the above, and that's part of the headache of using Microsoft Project, is there's so many ways to get to the constraints field. You can, let's see, I'm going to try to go through each one of these. Let me share my screen. So one of the ways was double-clicking on a task, go to the Advanced tab, and there's your Start No Earlier Than constraint. Okay, that's the most common way. The other way is right-click, task information. There you go. There's the Advanced tab again, and there's your constraint. We could go to the View tab, do a split, but the split type we need is something called a Task Details form, which of course is covered in the video. The Task Details form, there you go. There's the constraint. So there's the third way. Another way is we could insert a column called Constraint Type. And that's a great way to see all your constraint types. That's really useful if you're troubleshooting. And of course, the one way that wasn't in the video there was to be on the task and use the ribbon and use the task information button to get to the Advanced tab. So a lot of different ways to get there. That's part of the confusion with using constraints is, oh gosh, where do I go to look for it? And the way I always go, to be quite honest with you, is I drill into the task, double click, and even though there are 6 tabs here, I am almost always on the Advanced tab, and I am almost always in the constraints. All the other tabs are nice to have, but I got other ways to get to them, and I would rather just use this for the constraints. Alright, I got another poll coming up here. This will be our quiz number 3. Here's the quiz. True or false? On the task information dialog box, the most important tab on the 6 available is the Advanced tab. True, false, or being project managers, that third response is going to be popular. Yeah, the answer, of course, is true. It's that Advanced tab, which actually you guys all selected. Yes, it's that Advanced tab is the one you want to get to because that's where you're going to find the constraints. Lecture number 2 was different ways to display task constraint information, and that went through just a lot of what we just covered here. There's so many different ways to find constraint information. You need to know at least one way, and of course double clicking and going to the Advanced tab is, I recommend, as the best way. That whole module should numb your brain. It goes through all those different ways, and you haven't even gotten into the details of constraints themselves, so no wonder constraints is such a difficult topic. It should set your head spinning a little bit. For me, if it was the first time I'm seeing this stuff, I'm playing these videos a couple of times or stopping them and rewinding them. There's that thing called the aha effect. If any of you have been teachers, you know what I'm talking about. It's just all of a sudden you're driving down the road and you go, aha, I get it, and it's nothing you can do about it. It's just something that comes to everybody differently, and that's what makes video-based learning so valuable. You can replay and replay and rewatch and eventually get to the aha effect. But the goal of the module wasn't to numb your brain. It was to expose you to troubleshooting approaches. As you gain an expertise, you've got to know different ways to get to that constraint column, and inserting the constraint column is absolutely a wonderful way of troubleshooting, or using that split screen I had up there with the task details form on the bottom. That's another way to find constraints, because if there's one thing that's going to trip up a project schedule, it's going to be constraints. Okay, so that sets the stage on the potholes out there on the highway. The next thing to bring up is this thing called, and this is in video 3, called the deadlines. So I'm going to double click on a task, and in the Advanced tab you see this deadline feature. Now this appeared, I believe, in Project 2003. I could be wrong. It may have been in Project 2000. Most people don't realize that a deadline is actually a type of constraint. And it's absolutely essential to understanding deadlines and realizing it is a constraint to be able to use constraints effectively. So I'm setting the table here for the end game in this whole constraints presentation or approach in the 5 keys method, because deadline is a key component. Deadline with must start on is actually the constraint I always use. Well, not always, but almost always. It is the most reliable approach, but I'm building up to that. So alright, so this lecture on deadlines went through what happens when a task goes past its deadline, and again you get a little warning indicator. But the more important thing to realize with deadlines is that you can't use them frivolously. Some people go, oh, these deadlines are great, and they put them on all their tasks, and what you're doing is you're changing the critical path calculation. And as you know from last week, a critical path is absolutely key for a project manager to be able to monitor the important tasks that are driving the schedule and hit the finish date. So if you're dropping deadlines throughout your project schedule, you are basically throwing mud on your windshield and you can't see where you're going. So you really want to save deadlines for tasks you really want to monitor and make sure that are on place. So you want to use deadlines very sparsely. And I got a little value add here for the webinar. So I'm gonna use this another task. It's on the screen. I'm going to increase the duration to, let's go 8 days. Okay, so there's my task on the screen, and I'm going to put a deadline on it for, let's say August 5th. So I double click on the task. I'm going to put on an 8. Let's go August 6th. Okay, there's the deadline marker out there, and the value add is you can actually use the mouse pointer to move the deadline marker. And there you go. And again, the previous trick I showed you was on the Format tab under Format, Bar Styles. To get that deadline marker to appear on top of the bars, you want to cut that row and make sure your deadline is the last entry in the table. Then it will always draw on your charts. Okay, so to show you that the deadline did in fact move, I'm going to double click on the task, and there you can see it moved from the August date into July. Alright, the next video was the problem with using deadlines. So the previous video, video 3, set the stage for this lecture. Adding a deadline to a task is a great way to have Project monitor a task finish date for you. But unfortunately, there's a critical flaw. It can change the total slack. Actually make a task total slack be a negative. To see that, I'm going to widen the screen here, and I'm going to insert a column. So I'll go to the Format tab, Insert Column, and I'll put in total slack. And you can see here that with the deadline on the another task, it actually shows the total slack as a negative number. So you've got to be very careful with how you use total slack. And let me do the marketing example so you can see that in a different way. Okay, so here on the screen I've got the basic marketing and manufacturing critical path problem. So on the Format tab, I'm going to turn on the critical tasks so you can see that the critical tasks are set up equipment, manufacture product. And I'm going to turn on the slack bar so you can see where the slack is at. And clearly here you can see that the marketing tasks are the ones that aren't on the critical path because they have total slack of 2 days. Okay, so let's show the impact of the deadline, and let's make the deadline for the print materials be noon on October the 2nd. So we double click on print materials, go to the Advanced tab, and we go 10 to 12 at 12 p.m. Set our deadline, click OK, and as you can see here, it's definitely changed the critical path. The critical path is now also on the marketing task, and you actually got a negative number on the total slack. And again, you're going, okay, Kevin, what happened to the deadline marker? Same problem that I demonstrated before on the Format tab. If you want to be able to see the deadline marker all the time, you got to go into Format, Bar Styles, go all the way down to the bottom, find your deadline, cut the row, go to the last row, paste the row, click OK. You'll get your deadline marker to appear on top, and you can see right there it's halfway through the one-day task for print material, thus making it easy to understand why the total slack is negative. So the only way you're going to get a negative total slack number is if you use the deadline marker. And now you see the prime problem with using deadlines. If you use them all over the place, you're going to turn your entire project schedule into nothing but a critical path. Now, maybe in the case of this project plan, that's exactly what you want to do. You are very concerned about the print material happening on time, and therefore you stuck a deadline marker on it because you want to be able to watch it closely. If that's your intent, that's a good way to use deadlines. However, if you're just putting on deadlines because you can, that's not a good use. Okay, and to take a deadline off, you simply double click on the task, go to the Advanced tab, and delete out the deadline, and click OK, and it's gone. Alright, so a value add quick tip here is the only way you can get a negative slack on a task is with the deadline feature. So if you ever see negative total slack, you know you've got a deadline acting in that sequence of tasks. It's usually on the last task that has the negative slack. And the other thing is, how do you remove a deadline? You double click on the task, go to the deadline and delete it out, or type in an NA as in not applicable. Okay, it's time for a quiz. Okay, here's our fourth quiz for tonight. It's a true or false quiz, and here's the question. If a task has a deadline date, it can affect the late start, late finish, and thus the critical path calculation. Is this true, or is this false? Okay, the votes are in. And the answer is it's true. As we just demonstrated, as soon as you put a deadline date on a task, it not only affects the critical path calculation, it affects the total slack and thus the late start and late finish. All right, let's go on to our next quiz, quiz number 5. True or false? For the 5 keys method, is it okay to use the ALAP constraint type? ALAP is as late as possible. And the answer is, of course, false. ALAP is a constraint you definitely do not want to use. It causes a task to seek the finish date in the project schedule, and thus it makes the project wind blow from the left-hand side, which is counterproductive. Nothing wrong with using ALAP and the other finish date type constraints, but again, those are mostly used when you, as the video talked about, when you're scheduling from a finish date. That's a very unusual proposition. Almost no books go out and show you how to use the finish date scheduling approach. Most every single book out there in course will talk about using Microsoft project scheduling from a start date, and thus the as late as possible constraint is never encountered, never discussed. If you use the ALAP, you are pretty much going on your own. So do not use the ALAP nor the SNLT or the FNLT constraints. Again, that's all covered in the videos. All right, let's do one more quiz here. Okay, quiz number 6, true or false? The indicators column can only be used in the entry table. True or false? Okay, the answer is false. Again, the indicators column is just like any other column in Microsoft Project. It is a field in the database. The database is the container that holds all the information for your project. It is going on in the background. 300 and some fields are back there, as we've talked about. You can always see those fields with the insert column command. And of course, any view, whether it's on the entry view, the scheduling view, whatever view you happen to pop up, you can always insert the indicators column by going to the Format tab, picking Insert Column, and selecting the indicators column. And for the 5 keys method, the indicators column is extremely helpful, and you definitely want to use it. So let me bring up Microsoft Project, and let me go to a view that does not have the indicators column. That would be under View, Tables. We'll go to the Summary view. Summary view does not have an indicators column, so on the Format tab I simply click on the Insert Column, type in an I for indicators. There's the indicators column, insert it, and there you go. And if you're going, Kevin, how do I know the indicator column is there? I can very easily go to the Advanced tab, and let's put on a deadline of October 7th. Oh, let's go with October 3rd. There is the indicator, and there is the icon for a deadline sitting out there in the Gantt chart, and I'll increase the duration of the marketing plan, and there you go. the indicator has gone off as I've exceeded the deadline. So indicators, very important in the 5 keys method. If you ever don't see the old blue eyes in there in your first column, simply go to the Format tab and pick Insert Column and drop in Indicators. Okay, the next video in this section, the constraint sections, was the video on the ALAP and ASAP constraints. ALAP, again, is as late as possible. ASAP is the as soon as possible constraint. And as we've seen in the 2 earlier lectures, setting up and using constraints is fairly easy. We'll, on the screen here, we'll go to a split screen view. So I'll pick View, Details, and let me pick the Task Details view. Task Details form, excuse me, because it gives you constraints. And as you can see, all of the tasks here have the as soon as possible constraint applied, and that is the default. So again, the as soon as possible constraint, of course, does not need a date. It does not apply because the project wind is always blowing from the right-hand side of the task, pushing the task towards the tabletop, which is the project start date. And of course, the other emphasis in video 5 was to never use the as late as possible constraint, which we've covered several times now. Okay, that takes us on to the next video, video 6, the SNet constraint and how to remove constraints. The SNet constraint, of course, is the Start No Earlier constraint, and probably is one of the most used constraints in Microsoft Project. And it's usually by accident, although it can be intentional. And of course, you know now that if you go in, I'm going to put in a test task here, and you type in a start date, and I'll put in a start date of 10/5/12. And you know that by typing in the start date, you create what's known as an SNet test, Start No Earlier, or SNet constraint, Start No Earlier than constraint. And this lecture went over how this constraint can be created and what it does to your schedule. And then that lecture closed out by reviewing how you remove a constraint from your task. And again, we already know how to remove a constraint from a task. We just double click on it, go to the Advanced tab, and simply change the constraint type back to an ASAP as soon as possible. That's really removing a constraint. So the important thing to understand there is you really don't remove constraints, you set them back to as soon as possible. And this again is a good time to review the trick about inserting a column. But before I do that, let me go back to the View tab. Let me change the table back to the Entry table. That's a more familiar table for us. Let me make some adjustments here in column widths. And let me run the marketing plan back down to 1 day to get back to the original setup. And I might as well remove that deadline while I'm in here. So I'll double click on the task, go to the Advanced, and delete out the deadline. So I basically got everything back to where it was. Okay, so the trick I wanted to go over is if you're wondering if you've accidentally set some constraints. Now, of course, the indicators column is showing we don't have any constraints in place, but just for troubleshooting, you can always go into Format, Insert Column, put in the constraints type, and there you go. We can see that all our tasks are as soon as possible. We don't have any as late as possible tasks in there, task constraints that are sitting and waiting to cause us problem. And of course, in that video number 6, it told you that the problem with the blue-eyed warning column is that you won't see an ALAP constraint crop up, and thus the best way to see that constraint is either to split the screen and use a task details form so you can see the constraint type in the bottom, or when you're troubleshooting, drop in a constraint type column in your Gantt table and look for that sort of anomaly there. So the main problem the video 6 closed out with is that the SNet and the FNet tasks, of course, constraints move their tasks forward. So when I put in a date, start date, in the start date field, I create a start no earlier than constraint, and then conversely, if I go into the finish date and put in a finish date, it changes to an FNet. Depending on what's the last one you put in, you're going to get that constraint type. And the problem with these is if you have a predecessor that pushes the task out. In this case, if I make this temporary test task and row 9 have a predecessor, say, of row 3, it pushes the task off that constraint date, but you get no warning that it happened. So that's the weak spot with the SNet and the FNet. It They're great for setting a task on a shelf, but if you ever have any links involved and the task moves, you're not going to get any warning that happened. Now, in the 5 keys method, that's not a good thing, because the way we look at constraints in the 5 keys method is you put a constraint on a task because you don't want the task to move unless it's pushed by a predecessor. And thus, if a task does move, you want the constraint to allow the task to move, but you want to get a warning so that you can use your brain as a project manager and figure out a way to deal with it. And again, all of that is covered in video 6. Alright, video number 7 was the FNet and the duration quirk constraint. Point here is, as a project manager, you often will have somebody give you a date range where they know a task can start and when a task will finish. Now, with Project 2012, a problem has cropped up because one of the 5 keys recommendations from the key number 1 is go into the backstage, into options, and then on the schedule tab set your default task type to fixed duration. Now, the recommendation to set it to fixed duration exists because if you do get into using resources, one of the surprises you get when using resources is the duration will change when you add resources if you don't know what you're doing. So to mitigate against that risk, the 5 keys recommends that you use the fixed duration. So I'm going to set that up as fixed duration, and I'm going to put in test task 2. Okay, so test task 2 exists, and you ask the person assigned to it how long it'll start, and they say, well, Kevin, I can start that task on the first day of the month and I will be done by the last day of the month. So you put those 2 dates in there, and in previous versions of Microsoft Project it would actually calculate out the duration for you. With Project 2010, that changed. If you have the task type as fixed duration, it affects how the actual duration reacts when you put in a finish date and then a start date and then a finish date. So if you're going to use this trick, and this is a very common trick, you have to remember to change the task type to fixed units. So with fixed units in place, I can take that same scenario where the project team member says I'm going to start on the first day of the month and I'm going to finish on the last day of the month, and as you can see here, it automatically calculates out that the duration is going to be 23 days. And a lot of times that's very useful. So for example, if this was a cleanup task and it was going to happen after the finish of the project, so you go, okay, the predecessor is going to be task number 7. So you put that into place. And if you want to clean up the task, you want to get rid of that constraint. You don't want the start no earlier constraint sitting on the task, because the only reason you put in the start and the finish date was to drive out the duration. And with that done, you no longer need the SNet popping up in there. You want to change it back to as soon as possible. The reason, of course, is if the duration on one of the driving tasks decreases. If the SNet was still there, that task would not fall back to the October 5th date. It would stay out on Monday because it would have a 10.6 SNet underneath it. So the trick there is, again, because of what happened in Project 2010, if you're going to use the technique of putting in a start date and then a finish date because you're trying to drive out a duration, so you use the trick of putting in a start date, then a finish date, drives out the duration, and then you remove the constraint by changing it back to an ASAP, and then you link the task as needed. That again was covered in video 7. Okay, that takes us on to our next quiz, quiz 7, true or false. The SNet and the FNet constraints are the only ones with blue dots in their indicator calendar icons. True or false? Okay, and the correct answer is true. If you look at all the different icons in the indicators column, and let's set that up here on the screen. We'll just use the schedule we have on the screen. We got an ASAP. Let's just do them in order. Doing as late as possible. ASAP, third one down would be an MSO, fourth one is an MFO. MFO, there we go. After MFO in the list is a SNLT. After SNLT, there's an SNet, and we got an FNet there, and that just leaves one more type, FNLT, and there you can see, oops, got the wrong one there, didn't I? FNLT. You can see that the only indicators with blue dots are the start no earlier than and the FNet. Alright, let me clear all those out real quickly here, and we'll move on to the next item. Alright, video number 9 was scheduling without links. This is a nifty little trick. Now that you understand constraint basics, you know how to create a simple, albeit inflexible schedule by just typing in start dates. So if I was to remove all the predecessors in this schedule, and let me remove the critical task and slack colors to make this a little easier to look at, I could just as easily have done a project schedule by just typing in start dates. So I could say the setup equipment is going to be on Monday the 1st and finish on Tuesday the 2nd. So if we go into that setup equipment task and I verify that as the date and press enter, guess what? I don't get an SNet, right? Because project needs you to change that date. If you want to get an SNet, you've got to actually change it. So I got to go in there and temporarily, if I want to use this trick, change it to 8:01, then change it back to 8 o'clock. And there's my SNet. If manufacturing the product is then going to start on August 3rd, October 3rd, I simply pop up the calendar, find October 3rd. And then the marketing plan, same problem. If I'm going to want it to be an SNet, I got to drop in the date, go back. Sounds silly, but you're trying to trick project into easily putting in a constraint for you. And then the print material is going to happen on the 2nd. Shipping is going to happen on the 3rd. And then you're finished, of course, on the 4th or 5th, however you want to put it in there. And there you go. You've created a simple project schedule without links. Now, I made a mistake there, didn't I? As I put that in there, I dropped it in as a link. That should have went in as the 3rd. There we go. Didn't pay attention to my own message. So you can create schedules that way. You can use SNets as shelves to stick tasks on. Not recommended, but it's a quick way. It's a nifty little trick. And now that you understand constraint basics and you know when and how to use constraints, nothing wrong with doing that. Okay, now we're going to close out this video review. Before I do that, let's get this project schedule cleaned up so we can actually use it for some examples here. So I'm going to set all these constraints back to as soon as possible. I want to reset up my links, get things in place here. And let's get rid of these test tasks. Okay, everything's set up clean. Nothing funny going on here, and I might as well get rid of the constraints column. I won't be needing that. Alright, we're back to a basic project schedule. We're used to seeing the manufacturing marketing basic schedule. And now I want to discuss video number 10, the SNLT and FNLT constraints, start no later than, finish no later than constraints. I'm not going to go through the logic behind the recommendations that are in the video on these two constraints. Just suffice it to say that you don't want to use these two. If you see an L in them, later than, start no later than, or finish no later than, just stay away from them. They're not ready for prime time. And I get a lot of argument from advanced users on these two that say, well, I use them because they work great for giving me a flag indicator that something has started too late or finished too late. And my argument back to them is, well, then use a deadline or use an MSO. Why add more complexity to what you need to know about Microsoft Project? Keep it simple. Must start on constraint with a deadline gives you everything you could possibly need. So video 11 goes through that. A must start on is a very good constraint. It's pay dirt. It explains why the must start on is the king of the constraints. Its only flaw with the must start on constraint is it deals with constraining the start date, and most project managers are usually constraining the finish date. And then of course that's where I'm going to jump down 2 videos there to video 11, gets into solving the constraint dilemma and basically says, depending on whether you need to constrain the start or the finish date, use a deadline for finish dates. And then if you need to constrain the start date, use an MSO. And that's pretty much the big takeaway from the constraints example. And of course, video 11 goes through the big disappointment in the constraints, and that's the MFO constraint. Unfortunately, that constraint is flawed. As soon as you link a task to the MFO constraint, it breaks. It doesn't hold anything in place, and that definitely is not what you want. So maybe one of these days Microsoft will fix the MFO constraint. I hope so. It works correctly when you schedule from a finish date. In other words, when you go into project information and you change that default, which of course the 5 keys says never to do, to a project finish date, and then you use an MFO or an MSO constraint, they work just like they should. But from a project start date perspective, only the MSO constraint works correctly, which is absolutely unacceptable, but that's the way it's been for years. So Moral of the story is in video 13. If you want to conquer the constraints dilemma, which basically in the 5 keys method is you want a task to stay in place until some other task moves it or some other situation changes to violate a finish state with respect to a duration increasing, then you want a warning, and then you want indicators to pop up. So that sets the stage to finish out tonight's webinar, and that is, let's look at the story problem. Okay, so the story problem for tonight was called the Dressage Jacket Project. And basically, here's how the story problem goes. The LED saddle project was such a great success, Dressage Delights was contacted by the marketing staff of the Rolex Kentucky 3-day event to provide an LED dressage jacket for next year's event. The people from Rolex believe it was a great idea to take the use of LEDs and apply it to the jacket, as it'll make it easier for the judges and the spectators to follow the riders, while still preserving that formal look they like with the jackets. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with equestrian events. They usually use a little number tag or these pennies, they call them, that they pull over their jackets, which is basically a big plastic form with a number on it. And here the idea is they want to use jackets that have these LEDs that automatically light up on the jacket and rotate around and show the number at all different angles, so it's easier to pick up the riders without using the look. So Rolex people are excited about this. The CEO's got the agreement, and he's called you with some information, and he wants you to figure some things out for him. So the project's pretty simple. Just involves 5 straightforward tasks. Select the jacket style, design the jacket, fabricate it, ship it, and then the event begins. And there's nothing funny here in this project. It's got to start in the first working day next April. All the tasks are only Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 working days, so there's no calendar curveballs going on here. And thus the CEO wants to know if the second task, design the jackets, which requires a special Japanese designer who is skilled in making LED t-shirts and thus would be perfect for this jacket project, but that designer is only available on April 7th and no sooner, which tells you got a constraint, and then has to leave by the end of the day on April 18th at the latest, which gives you an indication that it's going to be a deadline. So the CEO wants to know if the designer's limited availability is a problem, and if not, when should the designer start and end their work? And the CEO wants to know if there's any other schedule problems. So this is a classic constraints problem. Let's pull up Microsoft Project and see how we would solve it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to project information. We're going to find the next April. We're going to have the project start April 1st next year. Okay, and then let's drop in our task list. So it's select jacket style, then design jacket, fabricate jacket, ship jackets. These would be the completed jackets, and then the event begins. All right, and then the durations were 8 days, 4 days, 1 week. Shipping takes 3 days, and then of course the event itself is 0. And since they all run in order, we just highlight them and link the tasks. Alright, so we've got a rough schedule here, and let's narrow some things down so we can see the screen a little more easily. And so now we need to drop in our constraints. So the Japanese designer is only available on April 7th, so we go into the double click on the task, go to the advanced tab. We thus have a must start on of April 7th. So I'll just type in 4/7/14. And then we also have a deadline because the designer can't stay past the 18th. So that's 4/18/14 at 5 p.m. So there's our 2 constraints, the MSO with the start date and the deadline. Okay, now we're getting a warning. It's telling us if we really want to use a must start on, and of course we do. All right. So we get a warning indicator, and immediately we can tell the boss, well, no problem with the designer starting or finishing. In fact, you can tell the designer they don't have to make it in until April 11th. Will fit fine within the time frame. But the other event that you've missed is you forgot to add a deadline into the event begins. So we go into there, and the event begins the last Thursday in April, which is going to be the 24th. So let's see if that has an impact. And we could tell the boss, well, boss, don't worry about the Japanese designer, at least not right now. Your bigger problem is, given this schedule, we don't ship the product until the 28th, or it doesn't arrive until the 28th, which is way too late. It's 4 days past when we need it to be there. So we need to more realistically deal with reducing that fabrication schedule or the jacket design. And then the boss is going to go, well, how much do I need to adjust it? And you would drop in the total slack column, of course, and you'd be saying things like, well, if we're going to make it on time, we really need to reduce the schedule down by 2 days. And the boss may say something like, okay, well, we can do the jacket selection in 6 days. Does that get us there? And you go, yep, that'll get us there. And he goes, well, do we have any problems there? Well, not really. We start on the 9th for the design the jacket, which is still within that range of the 7th through the 17th for the Japanese designer, and we just hit the event by the jackets arriving on the 24th. If you're comfortable with that schedule, we can go with that. And there you see, there's the benefit of the constraint types. If you were then satisfied with the decisions that were made, you could go in and change your must start on constraint to say, well, we're going to go ahead and start on the 9th. That'll get rid of that flag. But again, as noted in earlier videos and comments, what you want to do is you want to annotate, you want to put in notes, change the MSO to the 9th to the reflect. That's when we'll be able to have the Japanese designer come in, and given their Japanese designers April 7th through 18th constraint limit, as long as we have the designer start on the 9th and finish on the 14th, we'll make our dates. And the other trick would be to make sure the jacket style selection is done in 6 days. And that's the solution to the story problem. That demonstrates how you can use both the MSO and the deadline feature to help you manage your schedules and look out for problems, and how to change things and make things work for you. Okay, so to close out tonight's webinar, let me do a little summary here. Constraints are all about freezing a task in place on a schedule and having project tell you, or more to the point, warn you, if some other task moves it. Plain and simple, that is the reason for a constraint. You want to be warned if another task or a change in duration is the something else that is going to move your task. So again, something else that moves a constrained task is either going to be a predecessor change or a duration change. Those are the two things that will affect a task's position in the schedule. It'll either impact the start or the finish date. The other thing to get out of this section is, while there are 8 constraints, the end goal was to make you realize you only need to have competency with 2 of them. And that would be the MSO constraint, and the other one is, if you're not interested in the start date, you should understand how the FNet constraint works, because then you can pair an FNet with a deadline. So really, in total, you're looking at a total of 4 constraints: the ASAP, which is the default, the SNet, which is what you get if you put on a start date, FNet is what you get if you type in a finish date, and then MSO if you really need to watch a start date. And then the last constraint is what's not really realized is a constraint, but it is the deadline marker, and that deadline marker is what makes all of this work for you. And then the other big thing for beginners to understand is that when you type in a start date and a finish date column, you're creating that constraint. So you gotta really watch that. That's a really big thing for newbies. So now in real life, you'll probably use SNets, start no earlier thans, as that gets used a lot in schedules, especially in those type of schedules that do not use links. But now that you understand how constraints work, it's not a problem using an SNet as long as you know what's going on. And if you're really, what you're trying to watch is finish dates, then you understand the key point is to stick those deadline markers on those tasks so that you get the warning when your finish date moves, and you get the change in the total slack, so you know that your critical path has been affected. That's all for tonight. I hope this was helpful. Again, MSO and the deadline is the key to making constraints work for you. Hopefully that's a big takeaway, and you'll be able to apply it successfully to your project schedules. Take care.